Okay, today's recorded lecture is going to be on the first half of Chapter 8, Marriage and Cohabitation. Try to follow along. Marriage and cohabitation. Well, here are Kristen Steyer and Sandra Perry, a lesbian couple that sued for the right to marry in California, eventually victorious and part of the momentum towards a legal same-sex marriage. I tell their story in the chapter partly to illustrate that marriage holds a value which is both symbolic and legal. It matters to people that their marriage counts, that other people consider them to be married, and it also affects their rights and obligations and duties from the society, reciprocal duties between them and society. So marriage turns out to be very important for lots of people. One question we're going to ask is how the practice of cohabitation has changed the meaning of marriage in our society. It's one of the major historical changes that we're covering. Pausing for a minute, chapter 8, about halfway into the book, to just ask how everything we've learned that brought us to this moment, reflects on our key themes of diversity, inequality, and social change. Diversity, number one. One key thing that has changed, that has increased the diversity in cohabitation and marriage, is that about 2/3 of people who marry have lived together before they got married. That's a major historical change. We have also seen a rising prevalence of people who are the same gender, marrying and cohabiting, increasingly accepted both in the mainstream culture and in the law. So again, more different kinds of couples, more diversity. And we also have seen a great increase in the number of marriages that are remarriages, that is, people who have already been married before. So one of the ways that more married couples are different now than used to be is a lot of them are remarried and have all that complicated history and life history that they bring with them to their marriages. That's diversity. What about inequality? This figure shows the hypothetical expenses of a wedding in 2023 that had featured all of these items. If you had rented a venue, got catering, bought a ring, had a live band, a photographer, florist, had a rehearsal dinner, a videographer, planner, a wedding dress, hired a DJ, drove people around in limos, had a big cake, wedding invitations, favors, stylist, makeup artist. If you had all those things, the average wedding with about 117 guests would be $47,000. Not too many people do all of those things, but this is just to show kind of the scale of what you're talking about if you're talking about a big wedding with all the trimmings. What does this have to do with inequality? Well, weddings are expensive, and the people who get married are increasingly richer. So couples are increasingly pairing up by education level, both high and low. But more often high. That is, marriage is now more common for people with college degrees. So you have more couples where both people have college degrees. And marriage is less likely among people who are poor and people who are single parents especially. Another form of inequality, besides the financial elements discussed, is the matter of social recognition. So the lack of recognition of same-sex couples still affects them and reflects one aspect of inequality in their lives. Okay, social change. Well, social change is our category that reflects the growth of modernity, the modern individual in society. Certainly is the case that the growth of individualism in our culture and the goals of individual self-fulfillment associated with that have weakened the ties of marriage. Fewer people getting married, fewer people staying married than in the old days, not necessarily more and more divorces every year, as we'll see. But the ties of marriage are weaker than they used to be. The individual is now more important. Part of that is reinforced by the law. The law increasingly treats people as individuals rather than as families or as couples, regardless of whether they are married. So we are, even when we are together in marriage, we are legally as well as culturally more individual than we used to be. Modern identities have grown more diverse with all more different kinds of people embracing more different kinds of identities, which in turn parallels the increasing complexity of family structures and relationships. So more individual ways of being and thinking about yourself in modern society than there used to be contributes to this movement towards individualism in the culture and society, social change. Okay, so let's talk about who gets married nowadays. A couple of key trends. Marriage rates have fallen a lot. A lot fewer people are getting married than used to. As you'll see, it's not as much the case about lifetime marriage, but certainly at any one time, fewer people are getting married. I'll explain that in a minute. There are some very big differences in marriage trends between racial ethnic groups, especially with African Americans experiencing a more rapid and pronounced decline in the marriage rate than any other group. So we'll devote some attention to that specifically. And then, as noted, marriage is increasingly concentrated among those who are richer, those who have more education and higher income. So that's a key trend. These are three key trends in American marriage. To show you the breakdown by age and gender over time, this chart just compares two time periods, 1970 and 2021, 51 years apart. The numbers shown are the percentage of people who have ever been married by that age. So if you look at the first pair of bars, it shows men ages 20 to 24. About 45% of them had ever been married in 1970, now about 8%. For women, it's even more dramatic. About 64%, almost two-thirds of women had been married before age 25 in 1970, now about 12%. So that's where we've seen the biggest change is the drop in early marriage. If you go all the way out to the older ages, the last bars are age 45 to 54, and there you can see the decline has been much more modest. It was 93% of men ever married by the time they were about 50, now 83%. Among women was 94%, now about 86%. So it's not so much that people are not getting married ever, but they're getting married later than they used to, and somewhat less altogether, but definitely much less in their 20s and 30s than they used to. One way to think about this is that marriage is playing a less dominant role in people's lives than it used to, at least in terms of the clock or the calendar. The graph shows the new marriages for every 1,000 unmarried people in each year. So round numbers, 1950, almost 1 out of 10 unmarried people got married just in that 1 year. Almost 100 out of 1,000. Now it's down to 30 out of 1,000, so more like 3% of unmarried people get married in any 1 year. So that's a big drop in the annual rate of marriage. What that translates into, along with divorce and other things that we'll talk about, is people spending less time in marriage as a state of existence. So in 1960, the average American could expect to be married for 29 of the years between age 18 and 55. Now it's only 18 of those years. That's a 37-year window from age 18 to 55. People used to be married on average 29 of those years. Now they're married 18 of those years. So a big drop in the amount of time people spend married in that kind of core adulthood ages. There are fewer years of marriage, and they are occurring later in life than they used to. As you saw, people are more likely to get married later than they used to. Also less continuously. We'll talk about divorce later on. Why have we had this decline in marriage? Well, reason number one, let's say culture. Is it just individualism and self-centeredness? People don't want to be married anymore? Maybe they don't care as much about marriage. But on the other hand, maybe they care more about marriage. Maybe they idealize marriage more than they used to. So they are less eager to get into marriage because they have put it on a pedestal and they have an exalted view of it. They don't think their life or their relationship is worthy of a marriage. Maybe they delay marriage not because they don't want to, but because they want a better marriage. Okay, so it's not just whether they want to be married or not, but they have a higher standard for what a good marriage should be. It certainly is the case that among especially poorer people, working class people, the long-term commitment may be postponed by a sense of insecurity or uncertainty. People just aren't sure about the future. They're not sure where they're going to what their income is, or their living situation, or their job, or their education is going to be in the future. They're not sure what their partner's living or income or job is going to be in the future. And so they're just reluctant to make a long-term commitment that would essentially lock them into something that they're not sure about. Economic independence. Economic independence may contribute to the decline of marriage if it means people don't need to be married because they are now economically independent on their own. This is especially the case for women. Their increase in their earning power has boosted their own independence and reduced their need, or at least their perceived economic need for marriage. At the same time, men cannot as much assume that if they marry somebody, a woman, she will be devoted to caring for him and their children and their family because she's got her own career now and so on. So that's also changed the calculation for men about whether or not they want marriage. Men and women with higher incomes are more likely to marry than people with lower incomes, though. So if it was just about independence, then you might think rich people wouldn't get married. They don't need to get married. So why are rich people getting married more than poorer people? Well, they don't need to get married as much, but more people want to marry them. So they're more sought after for marriage in what we're going to discuss as the marriage market. So it's hard to juggle these different things, but the bottom line is there's less marriage and it's richer people. And so we're looking at multiple factors going on at once. One is definitely independence, but on the other hand, wealth and status contributes to desirability in marriage. What about people who are financially insecure, who have economic uncertainty and not sure about their own future? Marriage for them may seem like a commitment that brings more burden than benefit. That is, if you're relatively poor, marrying somebody who's relatively poor, what do you gain from it? That's a perception anyway. Most poorer people want to get married, but they're either not persuaded by the prospects they have, or they can't find someone who they can persuade to marry them. So they're either no one wants to marry them, or they can't find somebody who brings them enough security or advantage that they want to make that commitment to marry. It's harsh ways of putting it. The finances and economics are just one aspect of what's going on, but it is the case that growing uncertainty contributes to the decline in marriage, especially among people with less economic resources. Then there are some very specific things that have happened demographically that contributed to the decline in marriage. One of them was the baby boom. There was a huge spike in birth rates, as we know, from the mid 1940s after World War II up through the early 1960s. Now, if you think about the fact that women usually marry men who are a little older than them, that means that this big boom in birth rates meant that about 25 years later, there were a lot fewer men than women of marriage age. There was a shortage of men about 3 years older. So that sometimes just a demographic event like that can put a squeeze on marriage. That ended up lowering marriage rates for women. Maybe not permanently, but it gives us an example of something historical that can happen that changes the dynamics of marriage. I'm going to talk a little bit about race and ethnicity, especially on talk about the Black population. But before I do, just a comparison across our five major racial ethnic groups: Asian and Pacific Islanders, white, Hispanic, American Indian, and Black Americans. You can see big differences in the first marriage rate among never married people. So to read this chart, about 49 out of every 1,000 never married Asian women get married each year for the first time. That is, never married people marrying for the first year. You can see the rates are much higher for Asian and Pacific Islanders than they are for African Americans, who have the lowest rate. The other groups are in between. You can also see for each group, the marriage rate is higher for women than for men, except for Black Americans again. And that reflects the higher intermarriage rates for women than for men among these groups, except for Black Americans. We'll talk more about that in a minute. zeroing in on the marriage squeeze for Black women in particular, we have seen the historical developments that changed the economic context and condition for those big cities that attracted all those Black migrants from the South in the first part of the 20th century. By the 1970s and 1980s, industrial manufacturing jobs were becoming scarcer in those urban centers. Jobs were going away from the places that Black workers and their families had all moved to. And in particular, the loss of manufacturing jobs meant that men without college degrees had a harder and harder time to find steady work. One of the things, as we just saw, that makes people willing to take the plunge in marriage is feeling secure that them or their partner has a good financial future. Losing all those manufacturing jobs undermined that, especially in urban Black communities. So for those poor urban women who were mostly Black or disproportionately Black, their chances of finding and marrying men with decent jobs were reduced. That is, the men who they had been most likely to marry in the past, working class men with decent jobs but not college degrees, there were fewer of them and it became harder to get married. This can be described as a shortage of marriage partners for those women, which was then exacerbated by the high rates of incarceration among urban Black men that we saw in later years. So not only declining job opportunities, but increasing incarceration. Incarceration also leaves scars on men. So even if they're only incarcerated for a few years or something in their early adulthood, they may be that affects them negatively and affects their chances of getting married, getting a good job ever negatively. So those factors together combined to reduce the shortage of marriage partners for Black women. So to look at the trend concretely, you can see in 1950, Black and white Americans had very similar rates of marriage, of being ever married. And the gap really opened up after that. There's that period in the 70s and 80s. You can see when the Black marriage rate was falling much faster than the white marriage rate. I have the total on there just to include all the other groups. But you can see there's now a very big gap in the marriage rates between Black and white Americans that really was not present in 1950, sort of in the heyday of our manufacturing industrial economy. This is just an example of a specific piece of research I did with a former graduate student here, Joanna Pepin, now a professor at the University of Toronto. And we just showed how different the context was in the marriage markets for Black and white women. So each one of these dots represents one metropolitan area like Chicago, New York, Los Angeles for either Black or white women. The vertical line in the middle shows you that on the metropolitan areas on the right, there are more unmarried men than there are unmarried women in this particular age range, 20 to 45. On the left side of that line, there are fewer unmarried men than unmarried women. So the green circles are white, the orange circles are Black, and what you can see is most white young adults live in metropolitan areas with more unmarried men than women, and the opposite holds for most Black women. They live in places with a relative shortage. The y-axis here shows you how many get married each year, and the point is the fact that these clouds are drifting up and to the right means that in places where there are more unmarried men, women are more likely to get married, and most white women are in that advantageous situation. Just one way of looking at the marriage squeeze for Black women relative to white women. Okay. Why do people still get married? Well, you can ask them. They'll give you an answer. It might or might not be what we think is the real sociological answer, but it's at least interesting information. If you ask people why they got married, as Pew did in 2019, love is the main reason, either a major reason or a minor reason for almost everybody. Companionship, desire to make a commitment, those were big reasons. A lot of people said they wanted to have children. They thought marriage would be better for them. And then lower on down, is it financial sense, convenience, or they were pregnant, which is not as big a reason now as it once was. So that's one way you can do it. You can just ask them. But we can look more structurally, if we want, more historically, at the conditions under which people are making this choice and draw some other conclusions. There are some strong incentives still. Both state and federal governments offer rights and benefits to married couples. So everything from the right to be a parent to your children to pensions and everything when you retire, all favor marriage. We also have market actors, that is, corporations, employers, other actors in the market arena that provide incentives for people to get married, like if you want health insurance. There are also informal social pressures. Young couples often encounter advice. Hey, here's some reasons why you should get married. Or they're direct sources of pressure, like their parents or grandparents, or indirect sources, like again, like an employer or somebody who is pressuring them to get married. And the other factor is a little bit less concrete, a little bit more amorphous, but especially in a world with so many choices, so many legitimate or acceptable choices, people sometimes do make major decisions just out of imitation. They just are looking at a lot of choices and they follow somebody who they respect for some reason into another arena. The obvious example of this is like a celebrity endorsement for a product. Well, you're an important football player. You're very good at that, so maybe I'll trust your judgment on what kind of car to buy. It's sort of that thing that ends up also happening with major life choices. So I like your movies. You play a persuasive character. You're attractive and charming, and I see that you're married, so maybe I'll get married. People don't really literally think that way, but the idea is sociologically we can track these traces through the culture. Okay, so now let's talk about who marries whom. That is, when people do get married, they have to have somebody. Who is it? Okay, here's a couple of famous couples: Barack and Michelle Obama, and Donald and Melania Trump. So two different couples who got married at different times, and they give us some kind of clues about what we call marriage markets, what you might call a marriage market. We use that term to refer to that social space. Again, it's not a physical space. It's a social space. It's a place where people do certain things. Social space where people search for potential marriage partners. They're not just searching for a partner. They're also going to the store, going to school, and spending time with their grandmother or whatever else they might be doing. But one thing that's happening in a social space is they're looking for potential partners. Why do we call it a market? This is an economic term. To define it as a market, economists have said marriage has to be voluntary. That is, like other market activity, it has to be something you choose to enter into, and there has to be competition. There can't just be one choice, or it can't be a market. So there has to be some dimension of competition where people are trying to get your attention to marry them. The main economist that we draw from in this, thinking about it in these terms, was named Gary Becker. This fits a common particular stereotype that we see in American marriages, where there's competition, for example, between people who are more or less attractive, more or less rich. And you get these pairs like the Trumps: rich man who may or may not be the most attractive man in the world, a poorer woman who is above average attractive. Okay, so they bring something to this marketplace that allows them to, each competing in their own realm, make that arrangement. In the case of the Obamas, it's a very different situation, much more equal in the sense that they were both already professional, Ivy League educated, employed lawyers in the same city already. So their marriage market, if you will, was much smaller, in the sense that if they wanted to marry another successful Black lawyer in Chicago, there just weren't that many to choose from, but there could still be elements, obviously, of competition in terms of who meets and marries who. This idea of a marriage market is not without its critics. One simple criticism is that people have a lot of different desires and they conflict. You're not just, poor women are not just trying to find a rich men are not just trying to find an attractive woman, or whatever the stereotype is. These things are in competition with each other, and people may have other desires also. So it can't be so easily reduced to this kind of marriage, to this market type of decision. Maybe more fundamentally, is if you look at all the bad decisions people make, it really is hard to describe their behavior as something like rational, the way you might think of it in terms of like the way you compare car shopping or something, if indeed that is rational either. So it's not reasonable to assume that spouses reflect a conscious choice from many alternatives because they have fewer choices than you might think, and they don't have the they're not able to isolate their one source of motivation. So fewer choices shopping for a spouse than they would when shopping for a product. So especially people in constricted markets, like the Obamas in Chicago, for example, don't have all the choices in the world. So in some ways, this marriage market framing doesn't work for everything, but we teach it because it sort of helps understand certain kinds of decisions that people make, and it may be one of several factors that are in play if we think about these kind of market mechanisms. Let's talk about endogamy, which is marrying somebody like yourself, marrying or reproducing with somebody like yourself. When we talk about endogamy, we're often focusing on race and ethnicity. In 1960, just 2% of marriages, of new marriages, involved people from different major racial or ethnic groups. So 98% of people who were getting married were marrying somebody from the same major group. So that means, Greeks and Italians could be marrying each other, both considered white. Or Mexican and Venezuelan people could be marrying each other, both considered Hispanic, but those would but almost everybody was marrying within their same major group. So two Hispanic people, two white people, two black people, two Asian people, etc. By 1921, that figure had increased to 20%. So now 1 out of every 5 new marriages crosses one of those major group lines. And that's a very dramatic change, an increase of 10 times from 2 to 20. But that rate of 20% is still quite low compared to the potential for intermarriage that we have as our society has become more and more diverse. That is, if people married without regard to race and ethnicity altogether, we would see a number that was quite a bit higher than 20%. So there's still selection into marriage going on within these major groups. Here's one way to look at that. I took all the people who said they got married in the last year. This is in 2021. Did you get married in the last year? People said yes. I looked at the race or ethnicity of the spouse that they were with. This shows us the rates of intermarriage or marrying across these 5 major groups, at least as of 2021. So the way to read this is you go down these diagonals. Those are people marrying within their group. So again, the top left square, 86% of white men married a white spouse, a white non-Hispanic spouse. And I say spouse because I'm including the men who married men, although they're mostly, of course, marrying women. Continuing down that diagonal, 69% of black men married a black spouse. Only 28% of American Indian men married an American Indian spouse. 68% for Asian Pacific Islanders, 71% for Hispanics. Okay, so that's the diagonal. And you would expect, as you think about these patterns, that smaller groups would have higher rates of intermarriage. That is, American Indian population is the smallest group on here. If they walk out the door and marry somebody, they're less likely to marry somebody from their same group. Okay, and we can also look at where they're spread around the country and lots of other cultural and political issues going on. But one issue is the size of the groups. One comparison that you can make on this chart is the gender difference. Remember, I told you that women had higher marriage rates than men in most groups. You can see that the women on the right-hand side of this chart, for most groups, the women have lower rates of marrying the same race men. So if you look at except for in the black case. Okay, so if you look at Asian and Pacific Islanders, 57% of women marry an Asian man compared to 68% of men. Or if you look at the American Indians, 26% of women marry an American Indian man compared to 28% of men, a little higher for men. So women are more likely to be marrying out, if you will. Black women, 13% of them marry a white man, but 19% of black men marry a white woman. So in the black case, it is reversed. Black women have higher rates of marrying within their own racial ethnic group than men do, and they're the only group on the chart that has that. So that partly explains the lower marriage rates among black women, is that they're less likely to marry somebody outside their group, and there's racism and all kinds of other factors that contribute to that. Anyway, so you can look up and make comparisons on this table as you have time. Okay, in the categories of endogamy, we can also talk about education. Choosing a spouse of the same education level is not only common, but expected at this point, especially for people with higher levels of education. People with a college degree who marry somebody without a college degree raises some eyebrows. It's not normal or commonly expected as much as it used to be. In fact, when you look at all the married couples in one year, recently 2022, 3/4 or 77% were either both had a bachelor's degree or both did not. That is, 3/4 of American couples are on the same side of the college, no college divide. And that's higher than it was historically. So we're sorting to the extent that people get married, they're sorting into pairs of people who either both have college or both don't have college. And that's a very big divide. This is consistent with the modern ideal of marriage as a companionship of equals, the idea that people have compatible tastes and are in their pursuit of individual goals, that they will have somebody that they have a lot in common with, that they can feel that bond with. It's not surprising that education is one of the key factors that they use to decide. One deviation from the idea of endogamy, of like marrying like, of course, is sex or gender. Most people don't marry somebody of the same gender. We don't know that much about the selection of partners. We don't have as much research. We haven't had legal marriage among same-sex couples for nearly as long, but we are learning and developing that knowledge base. In terms of the official statistics, we really don't have very much. Most states do not even report data on the sex or gender of people getting married. So they may list two people, but they don't tell you their genders or report statistics on how many couples were different gender versus same gender couples, including big states like California and New York. So we don't have official statistics. We have to go by surveys or census data, which are essentially surveys. Most recently, the Census Bureau has started including same-sex married couples in their reports, but they estimate that it's less than 1% of all married couples, or less than 1 million same-sex married couple households. So we don't have, it's a relatively small group, not gay people in general, but gay people who are married or people who are married to someone of the same gender. And so we're just beginning to gather that information. Okay, that's it for today. We'll talk about the second half later.